Every child the Elbridges took in vanished. No graves, no farewells. Just shoes, left polished, and a house that hummed after dark. In 1897, Hollow's Edge called it charity. The Hill called it something older. Look up at the mansion's black windows and listen, do you hear it? That thin, glassy laughter that doesn't belong to anyone left alive. Tonight we open those doors and count the missing out loud. The Elbridges were not strangers to admiration. Jonathan and Eleanor Elbridge had come to Hollow's Edge in 1882 with wealth of uncertain origin, but manners polished enough to silence most questions. They dressed impeccably, contributed generously to the church, and held seasonal gatherings where neighbors were welcomed into candlelit halls lined with velvet draperies and mahogany furniture. The couple carried themselves with an air of refinement uncommon in the region, and though their speech bore traces of older, aristocratic schooling, they adapted quickly to the cadence of the town. Hollow's Edge, eager for patrons who could raise its standing, embraced them. What most defined the Elbridges, however, was their brood. Over the course of 15 years, they took in children 12 in total, each introduced as an adopted orphan from circumstances too tragic to recount in detail. At first, the town praised their charity. Families nodded approvingly as the Elbridge carriage rolled past, young faces pressed against the frosted glass, dressed in fine coats and gloves. To outsiders, it appeared a model of generosity, wealth, sheltering innocence, a sanctuary against misfortune. The pastor lauded their Christian spirit in sermons, remarking that in a world so full of cruelty, the Elbridges had chosen to build a family from broken pieces. But whispers began almost immediately. None of the children had birth records filed in the county. No one recalled seeing them arrive by train or stagecoach. They appeared suddenly, ushered into the estate, their names spoken at first in introductions but later fading into silence. Townsfolk remarked uneasily that the children never seemed to enroll in the local school. Few could recall them playing in the village square or running along the riverbanks. They were glimpsed only in passing at church on rare occasions, seated in a rigid row under the watchful eyes of Jonathan and Eleanor, their expressions curiously vacant, their movements restrained, as if rehearsed. At first, these oddities were excused. The Elbridges were wealthy, after all, and wealth often carved its own rules. A strict upbringing in line with older traditions. Yet the murmurs grew. Farmers' wives spoke of nights when faint crying could be heard carried on the wind from the estate, a chorus of small voices rising and falling until silence returned. A shopkeeper delivering provisions once claimed he saw children's toys scattered across the parlor floor. Yet when he returned days later, the toys were gone, and the room looked as though no child had ever set foot there. The estate itself reinforced these suspicions. Though magnificent in its construction, parts of it always remained shuttered. Certain wings of the house were said never to be entered, their doors locked, their windows covered by heavy curtains even in summer. Servants whispered of entire rooms filled with dust. Abandoned nurseries where rocking horses stood facing the wall, and porcelain dolls slumped lifelessly in corners. Visitors described an oppressive stillness, as though the house itself resisted the presence of children. By 1895, Hollow's Edge could no longer ignore what it did not see. Families realized that the children appeared to vanish as quickly as they had arrived. Where once there were 12, only 8 were glimpsed. Months later, 6, when asked, Eleanor would smile politely and explain that illness had forced them to send some away to distant relatives for convalescence. Jonathan, less patient, would cite boarding schools in New England, producing vague letters with fine handwriting that few were allowed to inspect closely. No graves were dug in the churchyard, no carriages departed from the station. The children simply ceased to exist within the town's memory. Still, few dared to confront them. The Elbridge's generosity had bound Hollow's Edge in obligation. Repairs to the chapel roof paid in full, baskets of food sent to widows in winter, coins slipped quietly into the offering plate. To question them outright seemed ungrateful, even disloyal, and so the townspeople watched in silence as the number of children dwindled, convincing themselves that the answers lay in distant schools or convalescent homes. Yet a shadow spread. The once admired couple began to inspire unease. Mothers warned their own children not to wander near the estate. Farmers swore the woods around the property grew darker, as if the trees themselves bent inward. At night, the high windows of the mansion glowed faintly, though no lamps were lit inside, and those who passed by after midnight claimed they heard not crying, but laughter thin, hollow, and strangely repetitive, as though echoing from an empty room. By the winter of 1897, the truth could no longer be contained by silence. It was then that an anonymous letter reached the sheriff, written in a hand so tremulous it seemed scratched by desperation. It contained only a few words: "The children are gone. All of them. Search the house." The letter marked the first official recognition of what the town had long feared but refused to name. The Elbridge family, once a beacon of charity, now stood at the heart of a growing suspicion, a suspicion that their generosity concealed something dreadful. Behind the estate's shuttered windows and locked doors, every child had vanished without a trace, and as the sheriff gathered his deputies and lanterns to prepare for the search, the townsfolk watched the mansion's silhouette against the winter sky, its chimneys unlit, its halls silent, the weight of its secrets pressing like a storm on the horizon. The search began at dawn, when the frost still clung to the iron fence posts, and the valley lay hushed under a pale gray sky. Sheriff Matthew Harlan, a man known for his stern composure and distrust of superstition, led the party of deputies and townsmen up the winding drive to the Elbridge estate. Their boots crunched against the frozen ground, each step measured, as though they feared to wake something long asleep inside the house. The letter had left no room for delay. The children are gone. Search the house. The mansion loomed before them, its gables rising like watchful sentinels. Curtains were drawn tight against the morning light. Smoke did not rise from the chimneys. Even the sparrows that usually gathered in the hedges seemed to avoid the grounds, circling instead at a distance. Harlan paused at the base of the steps, lantern in hand, though the sun had already risen. "We enter together," he said, his voice clipped. "No wandering off, eyes sharp, and remember we are here to find the truth, not to chase shadows." Jonathan and Eleanor Elbridge greeted them at the door with unnerving calm. Jonathan, tall and silver-haired, wore his usual black coat, his posture so rigid he might have been carved from the wood of the doorframe itself. Eleanor, pale and slight, stood just behind him, her hands folded in front of her. They did not seem surprised by the intrusion, nor offended. "Sheriff," Jonathan intoned, "what business compels you to violate the sanctity of our home?" "The town has questions," Harlan replied. "Questions about the whereabouts of your children." He scanned their faces for the slightest tremor of guilt. Eleanor only smiled faintly, her eyes distant, as if she hadn't heard the words at all. They allowed the search with a gesture of polite resignation, as though it were merely an inconvenience, like a guest arriving late to supper. The doors swung open, and the investigators stepped into the grand entrance hall. The air was stale, tinged with the faint smell of candle wax, and something else, something metallic, like rust. Their lanterns cast long, uneasy shadows across marble floors, and high-arched ceilings hung with darkened chandeliers. The deputies split into pairs, each assigned to a wing of the house. Harlan himself took the eastern corridor, its walls lined with oil portraits of unsmiling ancestors. Their painted eyes seemed to follow the men as they moved, their gazes heavy with judgment. Dust lay thick along the baseboards, though the Elbridges kept servants. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath their weight. The first locked door was encountered near the end of the hall. The key, provided by Jonathan with a look of annoyance, turned reluctantly in the rusted lock. Inside lay a nursery. The air was colder there, as if the room had been sealed for years. Small beds were neatly made with quilts faded to gray. Dolls with glass eyes stared blankly from shelves. A rocking horse stood in the corner, its paint peeling, its mane worn down to bare wood. What unsettled Harlan most was not the decay, but the order. Every toy in its place, every sheet tucked tight, as though the children had been marched out in perfect formation, and the room closed behind them. Further rooms told the same story. Trunks filled with children's clothing, folded and preserved as though waiting for a return that never came. Books of simple lessons and sketches, half finished, ink faded by time. In one chamber they found a row of small shoes lined neatly against the wall. 12 pairs, none with mud or wear, their laces tied in bows. Deputies exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke aloud the thought that pressed against every mind. These rooms had been left untouched for far longer than the Elbridges admitted. Meanwhile, in the western wing, another pair of deputies discovered a parlor that bore a different kind of neglect. Furniture was draped in sheets, but beneath them the shapes suggested once vibrant life. A piano, its keys yellowed, a chessboard, pieces mid-game, frozen in play. On a side table lay a scattering of children's drawings, figures sketched in charcoal, crude but unsettling. Many depicted the same thing, a tall house with too many windows, and small faceless figures standing outside it, their hands raised as if in surrender. By mid-morning, the searchers regrouped in the dining hall. Their findings were grim but inconclusive. No children, no evidence of departure, only absence, and the artifacts of lives abruptly halted. Jonathan and Eleanor sat calmly at the head of the long oak table as the sheriff laid the findings before them. "Where are they?" Harlan demanded, his patience thinning. "We've searched every wing, every room. Their clothes, their toys, their drawings, they remain. But not the children, not one." Jonathan's gaze did not waver. "As we have explained, they were sent away, to relatives, to schools more suited to their advancement." His words were smooth, but beneath them lay a steel that unsettled even the deputies. "And the records?" Harlan pressed. "Not one letter verified, not one birth certificate, not one grave for those said to be dead. Do you take this town for fools?" Eleanor's voice cut the air like a whisper of glass. "Children vanish every day, Sheriff, sometimes taken by illness, sometimes by fate. Perhaps you should ask why your people look to us for answers rather than to Providence." Her words, spoken with an eerie serenity, sent a chill through the room. The deputies shifted uneasily. Some crossed themselves. Harlan felt a weight in the air, as though the house itself leaned closer to listen. He slammed a hand against the table. "Enough. We will continue this search. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear." Jonathan's lips curved into something between a smile and a sneer. "Fear," he said softly, "is a condition for those who believe they are innocent." It was then that one of the deputies burst into the hall, pale and breathless. "Sheriff," he gasped, "you need to see this." The men followed him back toward the cellar steps. At the threshold, the sheriff paused. A foul draft rose from below, carrying with it the stench of damp stone and something far more sinister, decay masked by time. Lanterns were raised, and together they descended into the depths of the Elbridge estate. What they would uncover there would shatter the last pretense of charity and thrust the town into a darkness from which it would never fully emerge. The cellar of the Elbridge estate was not like the tidy storage rooms familiar to most households in Hollow's Edge. This was no simple space for apples in barrels or jars of preserves. The stone steps led downward into a cavernous gloom, the walls slick with moisture, the air heavy with the scent of rot, and something chemical sharp, acrid, stinging the nose. Lantern light revealed walls of rough-hewn stone, reinforced by wooden beams darkened with age, some warped, as though bowed by a weight unseen. The deputies spread out cautiously, their lamps casting jittering arcs of light that only deepened the shadows. Sheriff Harlan held his lantern high, his other hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "Stay close," he ordered, though his own voice carried the unease of a man speaking into a church at midnight. Against the walls, shelves sagged with objects cloaked in dust, jars sealed with wax, boxes nailed shut, and rows of what appeared at first to be simple household stores. But a closer look revealed otherwise. Glass containers held murky liquids in which floated scraps of cloth, hair. One deputy swore under his breath and crossed himself, muttering that no honest pantry bore such contents. Toward the rear of the cellar they found rows of narrow cots, their thin mattresses stripped bare, stained with dark marks that the lanterns made gleam wetly, though the stains were long dried. Shackles hung from the walls nearby, rusted iron cuffs bolted into stone. The room seemed less a storage cellar and more a chamber of confinement. The men exchanged glances, their bravado draining with each discovery. On a long wooden table lay children's belongings, carefully arranged. A girl's ribbon, a cracked slate with faint arithmetic still scrawled upon it, a row of tiny shoes mismatched but polished as if preserved for display. Sheriff Harlan paused before them, his jaw tight. Each object spoke not of care, but of cataloging, as if the children had been reduced to artifacts. Their lives inventoried like curiosities. "Good Lord," whispered one deputy, lifting a small stuffed rabbit missing one button eye. "What kind of people keep these things like trophies?" Before Harlan could answer, another deputy called from the far corner. "Sheriff, over here." His lantern illuminated a bricked archway, partially concealed behind crates. With effort, they shifted the obstacles aside, revealing a narrow passage descending still deeper into the earth. The stones of the stair were damp, and a foul draft rose from below, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of decay. Jonathan Elbridge's voice rang out from the top of the cellar stairs. "I must protest this intrusion." His tone was sharp, though he did not descend. "You have no warrant, no legal right to violate our private rooms." "Private rooms?" Harlan spat, gesturing toward the shackles and blood-stained cots. "This is no home, Elbridge. This is a prison." His voice echoed in the stone chamber, reverberating like a judge's sentence. Eleanor's voice followed, calm and chilling. "Curiosity is a dangerous vice, Sheriff. Some doors are locked for a reason. Ignoring them." Harlan ordered 2 men to follow him into the hidden stair. They descended slowly, the lanterns flickering as if in protest. The air grew colder, heavier, until each breath carried the taste of damp earth. The passage opened into a chamber circular in shape, the ceiling low, the floor uneven with stone. Here, the lantern light revealed something that froze the blood in every man present. Set into the walls were alcoves, each holding a crude wooden chair fitted with straps of cracked leather. In some, the straps still bore the indentation of wrists too small to have been adult. Symbols were carved into the stone above each alcove, marks not recognized by any present spirals, interlocking circles, jagged lines that seemed almost to shift in the lantern light. But it was the central object that drew every gaze. A great chair fashioned of oak, high-backed and cruel in its construction. Copper wires ran from its arms and headrest into the surrounding walls, vanishing into cracks and conduits. At its foot lay a scatter of bones, small, delicate, unmistakably human. One deputy dropped his lantern in shock, the glass shattering, the flames snuffing out. The sudden darkness seemed to surge inward until Harlan relit it with shaking hands. The sheriff knelt briefly by the bones, brushing away dirt to reveal the curve of a child's jaw, teeth still small and white. He closed his eyes, whispering a prayer more desperate than devout. The men turned to Harlan for guidance, but he could find no words. Here was evidence not of accident, nor of neglect, but of something deliberate, something ritualistic. The objects, the symbols, the machinery, all suggested intent far beyond cruelty, into a realm that chilled reason itself. From above, Jonathan's voice carried once more, though fainter now, as though he had stepped back into the house. "You should not linger in places where you do not belong," he said. "This house remembers, and it does not forgive." The deputies, hardened men of the frontier, shifted uneasily, some whispering that the Elbridges had trafficked with darker forces, that the curse spoken of in hushed tones was no superstition but truth. Harlan silenced them with a look, though the fear in his own eyes betrayed that he, too, felt the weight of something unseen pressing upon them. They gathered what they could, ribbons, shoes, bones to bring as evidence. Each man carried the sense that they bore not merely proof of crime, but relics of blasphemy. As they ascended back into the cellar's first chamber, the air grew warmer, but no less oppressive. Jonathan and Eleanor were gone, their absence more sinister than their presence. The heavy door at the top of the stairs stood open, the winter light spilling faintly inside, though none could recall hearing it creak. When the men emerged at last into the gray daylight, townsfolk had gathered at the gates, drawn by rumor and dread. Faces pale, eyes wide, they pressed forward, demanding answers. Sheriff Harlan, lantern in hand, raised the bundle of children's belongings before the crowd. His voice cracked as he spoke. "They are gone," he said. "All of them. And what lies below that house is not fit for the telling." The crowd murmured prayers, some weeping openly. Mothers clutched their children closer. Fathers swore oaths of vengeance. The name Elbridge, once spoken with reverence, now carried the weight of damnation. But even as the sheriff tried to calm the crowd, he knew the truth. The house had yielded horrors, but not answers. The children's fate remained shrouded, their bodies incomplete, their voices silenced. The cellar had spoken of cruelty, but something deeper lurked, still unseen. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the estate, the house stood silent, its windows dark, its secrets intact. The investigation had begun, but Hollow's Edge was already changed. The Elbridge curse had stepped from rumor into reality. The town changed in a single afternoon, as if some invisible hand had knocked a pane from the sky and let the cold in. Word of the seller of the straps, the chair, the bones no bigger than a sparrow's ran from porch to porch, hitching a ride on every whispered prayer. By dusk, the church bell tolled without permission, and the square filled with faces that seemed carved from winter wood. Sheriff Matthew Harlan, who had always trusted paperwork and persistence, found himself speaking to a crowd that wanted something neither could give: a name for evil and a tool to break it. He set the salvaged items on the courthouse table with an almost ceremonial care. The ribbons, the tiny shoes, the cracked slate with faint sums. Each object seemed to darken the room. Beside them lay his hastily written report, already smudged by the damp on his fingers. The deputies stood along the wall, hats in hand, eyes red-rimmed. No one mentioned the indented leather straps or the copper wires that vanished into stone. No one spoke of the symbols above the alcoves, though each man had memorized them without meaning to. and now saw them in the grain of floorboards and the whorls of his own thumb. Jonathan and Eleanor Elbridge did not come when summoned. Their attorney arrived instead, a gentleman who carried a city's confidence in his posture and the smell of fresh ink in his papers. He placed documents on the table the way a surgeon places instruments. Quiet, decisive, a promise of control. Letters from boarding schools, statements from relatives no one in Hollow's Edge had ever met, receipts for donations to orphanages along the eastern cities, neat seals, clean signatures. Each page felt like a curtain drawn over a grave. These demonstrate the Elbridges' standing and intent. The attorney said, his voice as even as lamplight, "There will be no need for spectacle. If the sheriff requires further clarification, a hearing can be scheduled. Until then, I will thank you to return private property and to refrain from slander." Private property. The phrase traveled around the room and grew thorns. Sheriff Harlan leaned over the table until his shadow covered the attorney's papers. "I've seen enough to know those rooms weren't meant for keeping flour," he said. "If your clients want their property, they can come for it in daylight and answer for the holes in my town." Outside, the crowd rippled. The pastor stood on the courthouse steps, Bible open, reading psalms into the wind as if any verse might catch like a spark. Mothers clutched their children by the shoulders, counting them again and again with their eyes. From the far side of the square, someone started to sing a funeral hymn, thin at first, then gathering voices until the sound ran up the street and pressed against the courthouse windows. That night, the first depositions were taken. Harlan recorded the shopkeeper's account of toys that appeared one week and vanished the next. The seamstress who'd altered coats for the little ones, though she had never measured a living arm. The milkman who swore his deliveries tripled without explanation. "They were feeding more mouths than we saw," he said, pinching his cap in both hands. "Or else they were feeding emptiness. In the lamplight's narrow world, testimony accumulated like frost." A stable boy described hearing bells underground, a faint chiming nowhere on the property there ought to be bells. A maid, dismissed last summer, whispered that she'd been told never to dust the north bedrooms. "You could see footprints in the powder," she said, but none led out the door. Another servant spoke of Eleanor, moving through the corridor after midnight with a basin that smelled like vinegar and iron. All of Jonathan, carrying a ledger whose pages were blacked out, except for one column of numbers that always ended at 12. The attorney objected to everything. The pastor prayed through everything. The town listened and did not sleep. Morning brought summonses and inventories. Harlan sent riders to neighboring counties, asking after children with the names the Elbridges had offered the church over the years, names that now felt like masks. He wired the state for an investigator, for a proper magistrate, for someone whose authority would stand when the attorney's signatures were stacked to the ceiling. He sealed the cellar, posted 2 men at the door, and wrote in his book, "If there is a law for this, I cannot find it." Before noon, the first omens arrived. That is what the town called them, for lack of a gentler word. Cows lowed and would not enter the Elbridge lane. The ice in the trough behind the courthouse formed a web of radiating cracks no one had seen the night before. The pattern like a wheel with 12 spokes and a broken 13th. In the churchyard, crows gathered on the yew as if attending a service of their own and would not be frightened off. A deputy swore he saw chalk lines at the base of the courthouse steps, those same carved symbols transposed into dust, though when he bent to wipe them away, there was nothing. The witnesses changed, too. Some remembered clearly, others not at all. A woman who had sworn she'd seen 6 children through the parlor window now insisted she must have been mistaken, for the glass was wavy and the light poor. A man who had said he heard crying admitted he might have heard song. Even the shopkeeper faltered over his story until the sheriff placed the cracked slate in front of him and asked quietly, "Then why was this left in a cellar with straps?" The shopkeeper bowed his head and wept. By afternoon, a court date was set for the following week, a hearing. The attorney called it to diffuse rumor and restore dignity. But dignity was a word that could not find purchase in Hollow's Edge anymore. The men built watchfires along the road to the estate, and the women brought bread as if for a wake. Children were kept indoors. Doors were barred before sundown. The bell rope in the church was tied down. Yet the bell tolled once at midnight, and once again at 1, though no hand moved it. The deputy on duty at the Elbridge gate heard it and wrote the times on a scrap of paper as if that might anchor them to sense. In the ruin of sleep that passed for night, the sheriff dreamed of a ledger with 12 empty rows and 1 line inked in red. He woke to hoofbeats. By lantern, he found a rider from the east with answers that were only more questions. No boarding school had enrolled a child of the Elbridge name, or any alias provided. No relative's address existed beyond a vacant lot. The orphanage letters were copied perfectly, but copied nonetheless. The ink matched, the turns of phrase matched, the seals were pressed from the same plate. It was a paper theater, convincing until you tried to open a door and walk into a room. Word galloped faster than any horse. By noon, the square was a hive of purpose. Carpenters hammered together crude barricades for the estate road. The blacksmith fashioned a brace for the courthouse door. The pastor and his wife prepared kettles of broth as if feeding the weary could keep despair from feeding on them. A committee assembled to escort Jonathan and Eleanor to the hearing. Someone suggested shackles, someone else suggested fire. Sheriff Harlan said no to both, with a force that surprised him. "We will not leave the law," he said, though the law felt like a narrow plank over bottomless dark. "We will hold fast to what we are." The committee set out at dusk. As they passed the church, the bell gave a single iron breath, though no rope moved, and the door was barred. The men did not look back. Beyond the last fence, the Elbridge estate rose black against the sky. Every window unlit but bright in the mind, like eyes that had been opened too long. Behind them, the town exhaled and waited, and the watchfires along the road burned like a row of small, stubborn suns against a night that, at last, had learned their names. The days that followed the cellar discovery were heavy with dread, as though the very air of Hollow's Edge had thickened. The sheriff ordered guards posted around the Elbridge estate, yet none wished to serve the watch. Deputies confessed to hearing whispers along the tree line, children's laughter woven with weeping, though no figure ever emerged. At night, dogs howled until their voices broke, and by dawn their owners found them cowering under porches, eyes wide with terror. The estate itself seemed to grow darker, its windows like blind eyes that reflected nothing of the sun. The townsfolk demanded justice, yet what form could justice take without bodies, without names to write on headstones? Mothers whispered of curses, while fathers spoke openly of retribution, their words edged with the pitchfork and torch. Harlan, ever the lawman, tried to bind them to process, to paper and testimony, but paper seemed brittle against the weight of superstition. The attorney returned with polished shoes and sharper words, waving forged letters and seals as though ink could scrub away the cellar's stains. Each denial from his lips only fanned the crowd's anger further. Eleanor Elbridge was seen in town once during this time, veiled and gloved, buying candles though her house already brimmed with them. Children who watched from the alleys claimed her lips moved soundlessly, whispering to each candle before setting it in the cart. The story grew until neighbors swore she had bought enough wax to keep a church burning through winter, though no priest would bless her offerings. Jonathan, for his part, was glimpsed in the courthouse yard at dusk, staring at the gallows as though measuring timber for a future use. When asked why, he replied only, "Every house must have its pillars." None pressed him further. The sheriff gathered depositions with mounting frustration. The accounts painted a picture too strange for a court, yet too consistent for chance. A maid described hearing footsteps in the nursery when no children remained. A farmer testified that, while passing the estate, he saw 12 candles burning in an upper window, though the house was otherwise dark. A widow claimed she dreamt of children's hands tapping against her shutters, and in the morning found faint smudges upon the glass. Each tale seemed touched by madness, yet together they drew a pattern as chilling as any confession. On the third night after the cellar search, the guards fled their posts. One burst into the sheriff's office, raving of shadows moving beneath the ground, of voices chanting from the earth itself. His companion never returned. At dawn, they found only the man's lantern, glass shattered, wick unburned, resting on the frost-bitten soil as though set there carefully. From that moment, no deputy could be persuaded to stand watch. The estate was left to its silence. Rumors spread that the Elbridges were preparing to leave. Wagons were said to be seen near the back road at night, though each morning the ruts in the soil led nowhere. Others whispered that the couple had already fled, leaving only illusions to haunt the windows. Yet the grocer swore he delivered flour to Eleanor herself, pale but steady, and the pastor admitted, after much pressure, that Jonathan had visited the church, not to pray, but to measure the altar with a length of twine. The tension reached a breaking point when the courthouse bell rang at an unscheduled hour, its iron tongue sounding not noon nor vespers, but 13 slow tolls. Townsfolk poured into the square, convinced it was a sign of judgment. The pastor clutched his Bible, declaring that the number marked a covenant broken, that the children's souls cried for reckoning. Harlan tried to calm them, insisting it was only mischief or mechanical fault. Yet even his deputies crossed themselves as the final echo died. That night, the attorney returned once more, his coat dusted with frost, his hands clutching papers like shields. He demanded entry to the estate, citing property rights and law. None followed him. By morning, the townsfolk found his horse still tethered by the gates, reins stiff with ice. Of the attorney himself, no trace remained, save a single glove resting on the fence post. The Elbridges gave no explanation, nor did they acknowledge his absence. With each passing day, Hollow's Edge grew less certain of where law ended and curse began. Some called for fire to cleanse the house. Others whispered of exorcism, though no priest volunteered. Children were kept indoors, shutters nailed fast, and through it all, the mansion stood unmoved, its chimneys unlit, its shutters closed, yet somehow watching. Sheriff Harlan wrote in his ledger, "Evidence mounts, yet truth recedes." The cellar speaks of cruelty, but the house speaks of something older. If justice is to be found, it will not be in papers, but in fire or prayer. I fear the town may choose both. Thus, the investigation widened from depositions and court dates to whispers of curses and bargains struck. And though no child's body was yet found, every mother in Hollow's Edge swore they heard their names called in the wind. The morning after the attorney vanished, the town awoke to a silence that felt staged, as if nature itself had paused to listen. No birds called from the hedgerows, no dogs barked in the lanes. Even the mill wheel on the river seemed to turn slower, its groan dampened beneath the weight of dread. Hollow's Edge gathered in uneasy clusters, whispering of the glove on the fence post, of the horse left untended. Some swore they saw smoke from the estate's chimneys in the night, though no fires had been lit in weeks. Others claimed they heard singing drifting down from the high windows, thin, childlike voices, reciting hymns no church in town had taught. Sheriff Harlan, his ledger already swollen with testimonies that blurred the line between fact and delirium, resolved to return to the estate. But when he gathered his deputies, none would accompany him. Each had excuses: ailing livestock, sick mothers, sudden chills. Beneath their refusals lay the same unspoken truth: no man wished to step again into that house. At last, Harlan set out alone, his lantern swinging, his revolver heavy at his side. The mansion greeted him with its usual indifference. The iron gates stood ajar, hinges shrieking at his touch. The path was scattered with brittle leaves that crumbled underfoot like bones. When he reached the door, it opened before he could knock. Eleanor stood within, pale as marble, her veil drawn back. "Sheriff," she murmured, her voice scarcely louder than the draft behind her. "We expected you." Jonathan appeared beside her, immaculate as ever. Though his eyes seemed hollowed, the flesh beneath them sunken as if sleepless for years. "Come," he said, "we shall end these misunderstandings today." Without waiting for assent, he turned into the hall, his steps echoing like a procession. Harlan followed, though every instinct urged retreat. The entrance smelled of wax and old smoke, but beneath it lay something metallic, something like dried blood. The portraits along the walls seemed darker than before, their painted children's faces shadowed, their eyes catching the lantern glow with unnatural gleam. They led him into the dining hall, where the long oak table was laid as though for a feast. Plates of porcelain gleamed in the dim light, each set before a chair. Upon every plate rested a small pair of shoes, polished, untarnished, some so tiny they might have belonged to babes. Harlan's breath caught as he counted. 12 pairs in all. "Your evidence," Jonathan said softly. "You sought our children. Here they are." He gestured to the shoes as if they were proof of innocence rather than relics of absence. Eleanor's eyes shone wetly in the lantern light, though no tears fell. "They are safe," she whispered. "Safer than you could ever provide. Has liked it." "Where are they?" Harlan demanded, his voice shaking. "I don't want trinkets. I want the children." Eleanor laid her hand upon one pair of shoes, so small they could fit in her palm. "They are not gone, Sheriff. They are kept." She turned her gaze toward the ceiling as though listening for footsteps. "Kept where no harm can reach them. Kept for the covenant." Jonathan's lips curved into something between smile and snarl. "You cannot grasp the scope of our work. You speak of justice, but justice belongs to the law of men. We deal in older laws, older bargains. 12 for wisdom, 12 for mercy, 12 for wrist." He stopped abruptly, as though the words themselves had betrayed too much. Harlan slammed his hand upon the table, rattling the porcelain. "Enough riddles. Produce the children, or face the gallows." His voice echoed, but the silence that followed seemed deeper than before, swallowing even the creak of timbers. From somewhere above came the sound of running feet, light, quick, like children at play. Harlan's blood ran cold. He drew his revolver, rushing toward the staircase. Behind him, Eleanor cried out, "Don't!" But he did not stop. The upstairs corridor stretched long and dim. Doors lined either side, each shut. From behind them came muffled sounds, laughter, whispers, the scuff of shoes upon floorboards. Harlan tried the nearest door. It swung open on rusted hinges to reveal a nursery, neat and silent. Beds were made, toys arranged, dust lying thick upon every surface, yet the laughter persisted, drifting now from the next door down, then the next, like a game of chase he could never catch. At last, he reached the farthest door, its handle cold as ice. He flung it open and found only darkness. His lantern sputtered as if starved for air. In that moment, a dozen small hands brushed his coat, his arms, his throat soft, fleeting touches, like children darting past. He spun, but nothing stood in the corridor. Only the portraits on the walls, their painted eyes wide and knowing. Jonathan's voice called up from below. "You see, Sheriff, they remain with us. Always." Harlan staggered back down, shaken, revolver still drawn. He leveled it at Jonathan, whose calm expression did not falter. "If you've harmed them, they are not harmed," Jonathan interrupted. "They are preserved. Their laughter fills these halls. Their innocence sustains this house. Do you not hear them? Even now, they sing, and indeed, faintly, through the walls and the rafters, came the sound of voices, children's voices, high and thin, chanting a hymn that no church in Hollow's Edge had ever taught. The melody was sweet, yet each note carried a dissonance that gnawed at the ear. Eleanor swayed with the rhythm, eyes half closed in rapture. Harlan lowered his weapon, sick with dread. He realized then that the law had no language for what he had witnessed. Papers and trials could not summon bodies from shadows nor break covenants older than the town itself. He left the estate without another word, the hymn echoing in his skull long after the doors closed behind him. That night, Hollow's Edge gathered again in the square. The sheriff told them little, only that the children were not found, that the Elbridges denied all wrongdoing. The crowd murmured with rage and despair. Some called for fire, others for prayer. All agreed the town stood at a precipice, and above them, carried on the wind from the hills, came faint laughter, bright and brittle as broken glass. The days grew shorter, and Hollow's Edge began to live as if beneath a pall. Men who once laughed freely at the tavern now spoke in hushed tones, casting nervous glances toward the northern hills where the Elbridge estate loomed. Women barred their shutters even before dusk, murmuring prayers as though nightfall itself carried contagion. Children, restless and frightened, asked questions their parents could not answer. Why did the sheriff return pale and trembling? Why did the pastor's sermons now circle endlessly on sin without redemption? And above all, where had the Elbridge children gone? The sheriff's silence weighed upon the town. He would sit long hours at his desk, staring at the lantern flame until the oil burned low, his ledger open but empty. Deputies begged for direction, yet he had none to give. His revolver lay untouched. His badge felt like lead. The law demanded clarity, but the estate had given him only shadows. Meanwhile, the Elbridges carried on as though nothing had changed. Jonathan appeared in the square one morning to purchase lumber, paying in gold coins so old that none could recall their mint. He measured each beam himself, muttering calculations under his breath. When asked what he was building, he replied with a thin smile, "A place that endures." Eleanor returned for candles once more, filling her basket until the wax nearly spilled over. The shopkeeper swore she whispered to each wick before setting it aside, lips moving in silent benedictions. Whispers thickened into rumors. Some claimed wagons rolled from the estate at night, though no wheel marks scarred the road by dawn. Others swore they heard hymns drifting from the high windows, children's voices woven with Eleanor's clear soprano. The hymn's melody never matched any psalm in the church's worn hymnal, and those who heard it complained of headaches, of dreams, filled with corridors that stretched without end. The pastor, pressed by his congregation, agreed to lead a procession of prayer to the estate gates. One gray morning, townsfolk gathered behind him, candles and crucifixes held high. They marched, singing familiar hymns, voices trembling but resolute. When they reached the gates, the singing faltered. The iron stood open, though no hand had touched it, and the path inside was swept clean, as though prepared for guests. Jonathan and Eleanor emerged upon the steps, greeting the crowd with unsettling composure. Jonathan raised his arms as if to welcome worshippers. "You come bearing songs," he said, his voice carrying unnaturally far. And we too have songs. Ours are older, but no less holy. Then, as if on cue, the high windows filled with sound. Children's voices rose in a hymn so piercingly sweet that mothers in the crowd fell to their knees, weeping. Fathers clutched their hats, white-knuckled, unable to move. The pastor alone lifted his cross high, shouting prayers into the air, but his words faltered, drowned in the dissonant chorus spilling from the house. When at last the hymn ceased, the crowd scattered in panic, retreating down the road as if chased by unseen hands. That night, the square filled again, this time with fury. Farmers shouted for fire, demanding the estate be burned to its foundations. Blacksmiths hammered spikes and sharpened tools into weapons. Mothers wailed, calling the missing children by name, voices carrying into the night. Yet others trembled, warning that fire would not banish a curse but spread it. The pastor counseled prayer, though his voice shook with fear. Sheriff Harlan stood before them, gaunt from sleeplessness. If we act without proof, we fall into mob law, he said. If we wait, we risk losing more than children. This is no ordinary case. The law falters against it, but still we must not falter. The townsfolk dispersed, unsettled, carrying their fury back into shuttered homes. That evening, the sheriff returned alone to the estate, lantern in hand. He stood before the door and knocked 3 times. The sound echoed too loudly, as though striking not wood but hollow bone. The door opened of its own accord. No servant greeted him. The hall was dark, but the air shimmered faintly with the smell of wax and damp stone. He stepped inside, each creak of the floorboards like a drumbeat. At the base of the grand staircase, he halted. A row of shoes, 12 pairs, had been set neatly upon the lowest steps, each polished, each impossibly clean. And from above, faint but undeniable, came the sound of laughter. Not wild laughter, not joyful, but laughter repeating like a phrase in a song, endless and unchanged. Harlan backed out, lantern raised, until the cold night swallowed him once more. He returned to town, white as ash, lips pressed tight. When pressed for answers, he spoke only one sentence: "They are not lost, they are kept." And with those words, the curse of the Elbridge family rooted itself deeper in Hollow's Edge. No longer rumor, but certainty. The children were neither dead nor gone, but bound, and the town knew now that no law nor prayer would release them easily. By the turn of the next week, Hollow's Edge had ceased to be a town of order. It had become a town of watchfires and whispers. Families barred their doors before dusk, hanging sprigs of withered herbs above thresholds, as if weeds could ward off what the church could not. The blacksmith worked day and night, forging iron crosses, while the seamstress stitched small pouches of salt and rosemary that mothers pressed into their children's palms. These charms gave no true comfort, yet to walk without them felt like walking unclothed. The estate loomed over it all, dark against the winter sky. By day, it seemed deserted, windows shuttered, chimneys lifeless. By night, the high gables glowed faintly, as if candlelight bled through cracks in the wood. Some claimed to see silhouettes in the windows, children dancing hand in hand, their movements too precise, too uniform to be play. Others swore they saw Eleanor herself, a candle in each hand, her veil thrown back, her mouth moving in silent incantation. Jonathan was rarer still, but once a farmer spotted him on the roof at dawn, standing bareheaded in the frost, arms outstretched as though measuring the sky. Sheriff Harlan's authority dwindled as the town's patience thinned. The ledger on his desk was fat with testimony, yet none of it could anchor itself to the law. What judge would accept tales of hymns sung by unseen mouths, or shoes polished by invisible hands? Each night he returned to the square, repeating the same worn assurances. There would be a hearing. There would be justice. Yet his eyes betrayed what his tongue refused, that justice no longer belonged to the living courts. The turning point came on a night when the watchfires burned low. A group of boys, too bold and too curious, slipped past the guards and crept toward the estate. They returned before dawn, white-faced, clutching each other like babes. They told of following the path to the carriage house, where through the cracks they saw rows of candles burning upon the floor, each set before a child's toy. A doll with a cracked porcelain face, a wooden horse missing one wheel, a slate marked with fading sums, 12 toys in all. And at the center, they swore, stood Eleanor, her veil aflame yet not consumed, singing in a language they could not understand. The story spread by morning, and with it came the fury. Mothers wept in the square, demanding action. Fathers sharpened scythes into weapons. The pastor tried to calm them, but his voice faltered. "We must prepare our souls," he said at last, "for what we face is not of men." Hollow's Edge was no longer divided between believers and skeptics. All believed now, for disbelief had no soil left to grow. That night, the town moved as one. Torches were lit, pitchforks and hammers carried, not in stealth but with the open noise of a people driven past fear. They marched up the road to the estate, their hymnals abandoned, their prayers replaced with chants of fire. Sheriff Harlan went with them, not to lead but to prevent slaughter if he could. Yet he knew as he climbed the rise that the night would not be guided by law. The gates of the estate stood open, as if awaiting their arrival. The torches revealed the path swept clear, the hedges trimmed, as though the Elbridges had prepared for guests. The crowd surged forward, crying curses, hurling stones at the windows. Glass shattered, but no figure appeared. At last, they set their torches to the dry timber of the carriage house, flames leaping greedily into the night. It was then the mansion itself awoke. The shutters of the high windows burst open, and from them poured light, not firelight, not lamplight, but a pallid silver glow that shimmered like moonlight trapped in glass. With it came the sound of children's voices, rising in unison, a hymn so piercing that men dropped their weapons to clap hands to ears. Women screamed, clutching their children to their skirts. The hymn was not loud, but it was endless, each note layered upon the next until it felt less sung than woven into the very air. Jonathan appeared upon the steps, tall and still, his black coat gleaming in the unnatural light. "You cannot burn what is consecrated," he said, his voice carrying above the tumult without strain. "This house is covenant. This house is vessel. And you would break the vessel." His eyes swept the crowd, cold and measured. "But the vessel does not break. The vessel keeps." Eleanor emerged behind him, her hands cupped around a single candle. She raised it high, and at once the hymn grew louder, fuller, as if the very walls had mouths. The townsfolk faltered, some dropping to their knees, others stumbling back in terror. Torches slipped from hands and guttered in the mud. Only Sheriff Harlan stood firm, though his knees trembled. He raised his revolver and aimed at Jonathan. "Release them," he demanded, though his voice cracked. "Release the children." Jonathan's lips curved into something between pity and scorn. "They are released," he said, "released from sorrow, released from hunger, released from the grave. Can you say the same of your town, Sheriff? How many graves do your winters carve?" The hymn swelled, drowning his words, and the torches sputtered out one by one. The crowd broke, scattering down the hill in blind panic, leaving the sheriff alone before the gates. And as he stood there, revolver shaking in his hand, he knew what the town would not yet speak. Hollow's Edge had lost the battle. The Elbridge curse was not to be driven out by fire or steel. It had rooted itself in song, in covenant, in the very marrow of the estate. And somewhere within those shuttered halls, 12 voices laughed, bright and brittle as glass, echoing long after the crowd had fled. Hollow's Edge awoke the next morning as though after a storm, yet no storm had touched it. The sky was clear, the fields untroubled, but the townsfolk moved with the heaviness of those who had glimpsed something they could neither explain nor forget. The fire-blackened carcass of the carriage house still smoked upon the hill, its beams twisted like broken ribs. Beyond it, the mansion stood untouched, its shutters once more drawn, its chimneys cold, as if the night's display had never occurred. But every man, woman, and child in the valley knew otherwise. The pastor rang the church bell at dawn, summoning his congregation not for worship but for counsel. They filled the pews in silence, faces drawn tight, eyes restless. He stood at the pulpit, Bible open yet unread. "We are a town under siege," he said, his voice trembling despite his effort at steadiness, "not by men nor by plague, but by something older. The Elbridges have made covenant with it. We cannot stand as we are. We must choose, prayer or fire, faith or vengeance." His words carried little comfort. The parishioners left with more fear than resolve. Sheriff Harlan sat alone in the back, his hat in his hands, the revolver at his side. He had no words to offer them. The law could bind thieves, jail murderers, even hang the guilty, but it had no noose for shadows, no writ for curses. His ledger, once a shield, now felt like a record of failure. He had written, "They are not lost, they are kept." The words mocked him every time he turned the page. That afternoon, the town buried the attorney's horse. No one claimed the animal, and yet it felt wrong to leave it tethered to rot. The glove found on the fence post was placed in the churchyard beside the grave, a marker without a name. Mothers warned their children to look away, but children peeked all the same, their eyes wide, their whispers sharp. The Elbridges kept him too. Night came quickly, and with it the hymn. It drifted from the estate like smoke, winding through the bare branches, carried on the wind into every hearth and bedroom. Some shut their ears with pillows, others prayed until their throats ached, but the sound seeped in all the same sweet, thin voices chanting in harmony, repeating a melody that never faltered, never ended. A farmer swore his baby began to hum it in his cradle, though no one had taught him the tune. Another claimed his old mother mouthed the words in her sleep, smiling as though cradled by invisible arms. The hymn did not cease at dawn. That morning, it lingered faintly, as though the walls of the estate continued to vibrate long after the voices had stilled. Hollow's Edge carried on in a daze. The baker left bread unrisen. The miller forgot to release the sluice. Work faltered, hands shook, and all the while ears strained for the next note. On the third day, something stranger still occurred. 12 pairs of shoes appeared upon the church steps, polished, gleaming, each laced in perfect bows. They matched the pairs Harlan had seen in the mansion, yet here they were, lined in neat formation, as if delivered by unseen courier. The pastor refused to touch them. "They are offerings," he whispered, "or warnings." Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers spat in the dust but made no move to cast the shoes away. By dusk, the shoes were gone, vanished as suddenly as they appeared. Panic simmered into quiet surrender. The crowd no longer spoke of burning the house. They spoke instead of endurance, of surviving until spring, of tending to their own, and leaving the Elbridges to their curse. If they keep their covenant, perhaps it will keep to them, said the shopkeeper's wife, though her eyes darted to the hills as if daring the estate to contradict her. But Harlan could not rest in surrender. That evening, he returned alone to the estate, his lantern shaking in his grip. He walked the path in silence, half expecting the gates to creak open before him. Yet this time, They stood closed. He climbed them anyway, boots slipping on iron. When he reached the door, it did not open. He pounded until his fists ached, but no answer came. Only when he turned to leave did he hear the sound of children's feet running across the floor above, followed by a burst of laughter that froze him in place. He waited, listening, but the sound did not return. Back in town, he told no one. What could he say? That the children were alive, that they played in halls no living child should walk. He wrote instead in his ledger, "The house speaks in footsteps. The house laughs in echoes. They are kept, but not dead." And so the days passed, each one braided tighter with dread. The hymn returned at intervals, sometimes loud, sometimes faint, but always there, reminding Hollow's Edge that the covenant was unbroken, and in every whispered conversation, one question returned again and again. How long before the house required more children? By midwinter, Hollow's Edge had ceased to measure time by the calendar. Days were marked instead by the hymn. Sometimes it came with dusk, sometimes with dawn, sometimes in the dead of night when all the houses lay dark. But whenever it came, it held the town captive. Men woke weeping without knowing why. Women found their children humming in the corners, tracing shapes on the floorboards with their fingers, circles, spirals, symbols no one had taught them. Farmers swore the cattle balked at water troughs, lowing as though they sensed something foul. Even the river seemed to slow its current, its surface glazed with ice long before the season should have frozen it. The pastor tried to rally his flock with prayer vigils, but each ended the same way. At the stroke of midnight, the church bell tolled 13, its rope untouched, and the hymn spilled through the walls. Candles guttered, psalms faltered, and the congregation fled into the night, leaving the pews empty and the cross hanging in silence. One evening, when the hymn rose louder than ever, the pastor dropped to his knees mid-sermon and cried, "Lord, forgive us, our covenant was never with you." And with them came the certainty that faith had fled. Jonathan and Eleanor appeared in town less often, but when they did, their presence drew the eye like a wound. Jonathan carried himself like a magistrate, his black coat immaculate, his gaze scanning the square as though weighing each soul. Eleanor's veil grew longer, trailing behind her like a train, her hands always cradling candles she never lit. Children said she whispered names into the wax names of classmates who had not vanished, not yet. When asked, their mothers silenced them with slaps, terrified the words themselves might summon her. One evening, a widow named Martha claimed she saw children in her orchard at twilight. She rushed to gather them, certain they were the lost Elbridge wards, but when she drew near, the figures dissolved into smoke, leaving only footprints in the frost, small, bare feet pressed deep into the ground. By morning, the orchard's trees were barren, their branches stripped of fruit, though none had yet ripened. The townsfolk whispered that the children were not just kept. They wandered, thin shadows feeding on what life remained. Sheriff Harlan, gaunt with sleeplessness, resolved to end the silence. He summoned a council of the town's oldest families and laid his ledger upon the table. Its pages brimmed with testimony, the cellar relics, the shoes on the church steps, the hymn, the apparitions. "This is evidence," he said, though his voice cracked. "Not for court, not for judge, but for memory. If we do nothing else, we must record. The law will not save us, but perhaps record will." The councilmen, gray-haired and trembling, nodded, though none could say why memory mattered when memory itself seemed cursed. That very night, the town was shaken awake by a sound not heard before. Not the hymn, not the bell, but laughter rolling, wild, a dozen voices spilling across the valley. Mothers rushed to cradle their children, only to find them laughing too, eyes blank, mouths open in mirth that was not their own. Fathers clamped hands over their children's lips, but the sound pressed through as if it came not from lungs, but from the air itself. The laughter ceased as suddenly as it began, leaving the town trembling in its aftermath. At dawn, 12 new pairs of shoes appeared not at the church this time, but on the sheriff's porch. Each gleamed with polish, each laced neatly. Harlan stared at them, revolver in hand, but he could not bring himself to scatter them. He counted, as he always did, 12 pairs, always 12, never more, never less. He wrote in his ledger, "The covenant is full, yet it hungers still." The townsfolk began to speak of sacrifice, quiet at first, muttered in corners, then louder as desperation spread. If it feeds on children, some argued, better we give than have them taken. Others spat at the thought, swearing they would sooner burn the estate and all within it. But fire no longer seemed possible. The mansion had withstood torches once and shone brighter in reply. And so the arguments turned to bargains Jonathan and Eleanor had already made. On the coldest night of January, the pastor was found kneeling at the gates of the estate, his Bible open upon the snow, his lips frozen mid-prayer. The townsfolk carried him back to the church, but he never woke again. His body was buried without sermon, for no one dared speak God's name within earshot of the hills. That evening, the hymn rose louder than ever before, swelling until the windows of the houses rattled in their frames. Sheriff Harlan sat at his desk, his lantern guttering. He stared at the 12 pairs of shoes lined against his wall. He had not moved them since they appeared. They stood like sentinels, polished and waiting. He wrote his final entry for the night. "The children are not dead. They are not alive. They are kept. And one day, the house will call for more." And as he closed his book, a sound drifted through the open window, a child's voice, soft and clear, singing not the hymn but his own name. By February, Hollow's Edge no longer pretended to be a town. It was a husk held together by fear. The mill wheel froze fast, though the river had not iced. The schoolhouse stood empty, its lessons abandoned. Mothers kept their children indoors. Fathers forbade even the smallest errands after dusk. The church doors, once the anchor of the community, remained barred. Its bell rope was nailed fast, though the bell still tolled 13 each midnight, shaking the shutters loose from houses across the square. The Elbridge estate, untouched by time or frost, grew only more present. Its windows glowed faintly with the pale sheen of candlelight, though no smoke marked the chimneys. The shutters opened and closed of their own accord, like eyelids marking the hours. Sometimes, in the early morning, townsfolk swore they saw children walking hand in hand along the roofline, their feet bare upon the slates. By the time anyone dared to blink, the figures were gone. Sheriff Harlan kept to his ledger, though his hands trembled so badly that his script devolved into jagged scratches. He wrote not for the courts now, but for memory itself, lest the town wake one day and discover its own past wiped clean. His latest entries spoke of dreams in which he walked the corridors of the estate, every door locked but every lock bearing his name. Dreams in which the hymn bled from the walls of his own home, his children long buried singing from the grave. Each morning, he awoke with his revolver drawn, the barrel cold against his temple. The townsfolk whispered of leaving, of abandoning Hollow's Edge altogether. Some families packed wagons under cover of night, but none returned with word of safe passage. It was said the roads twisted back upon themselves, depositing travelers once more at the edge of town by dawn. Others swore the woods closed ranks, branches locking into walls impassable, forcing them home again. "The covenant binds us all," the widow Martha declared, clutching her candle charms. None leave while the house keeps. Jonathan Elbridge appeared once more in the square, dressed in his immaculate black coat. He addressed the crowd without raising his voice, yet every ear heard him. "Your fear feeds it," he said. "Your prayers sustain it. You have already given what it seeks." He looked upon their haggard faces with calm disdain. "The children are not yours now. They are ours. They are kept." He turned and walked away, and none dared follow. That night, the hymn did not rise from the estate. For the first time in months, silence held. Some wept with relief, others trembled harder, convinced that silence was only a deeper form of doom. At dawn, 12 small bundles were found laid across the square. Each was wrapped in linen, tied with twine. Inside each bundle lay a child's toy dolls, marbles, wooden horses, ribbons, objects remembered from the missing, each scrubbed clean, as though new. Yet every bundle reeked of candle wax and damp stone. The pastor's widow fainted at the sight. Fathers burned the bundles, though the flames sputtered and smoked with a stench so foul that the fire itself seemed reluctant. The ashes were shoveled into the river, but by dusk, the toys had returned to the church steps, unmarred by flame. This time, no one touched them. Harlan wrote in his ledger, "It is not satisfied with silence. It reminds us. It returns what it chooses. We are trapped in its keeping, as surely as the children." 3 nights later, a child vanished, not one of the Elbridge orphans, but a farmer's daughter, Clara, only 6 years old. Her parents swore they had barred the doors, shuttered the windows, placed charms of salt and iron at every threshold. Yet when dawn came, her bed was empty. Only her shoes remained, polished and placed neatly at the foot of the stairs. The mother wailed until her voice broke. The father struck the sheriff with his fists, demanding justice. Harlan could only repeat the words he dreaded. "She is not lost. She is kept." The town fractured. Some begged the sheriff to lead them in burning the estate once more. Others argued for sacrifice, better to offer than to have taken. Still others whispered of joining the Elbridges outright, of swearing themselves to the covenant in exchange for safety. The square rang with arguments until fists were thrown and blood spilled upon the cobblestones. Hollow's Edge was no longer united in fear, but divided in desperation. That evening, as snow fell in heavy silence, the hymn rose again, this time joined by a new voice, high and clear, unmistakably Clara's. Her parents collapsed in grief, clutching her shoes as if they might anchor her spirit. The hymn swelled louder than before, filling every house, pressing into every ear until even the hardest men wept. Sheriff Harlan stood in his doorway, lantern trembling in his grip, listening to the child's voice mingle with the others. He opened his ledger and wrote with shaking hand, "The covenant is no longer theirs alone. It has claimed us. It will claim more. And when the house is full, it will not stop. It will keep. And it will keep until nothing remains but the song." And though he shut the book, the hymn followed him into sleep, a lullaby for a town already half buried in its own grave. The storm that ended Hollow's Edge began without thunder. A stillness fell at dusk, a pause so complete it seemed the world held its breath. Then, from the hills, the hymn rose, not the thin, threadbare melody of past nights, but a sound fattened on months of fear, layered with new voices until it seemed the very air had learned to sing. Windows rattled, lamps guttered, mothers pressed children to their chests and found them smiling with someone else's joy. And in the silence between notes, a bell tolled 13, slow and sovereign, though the church door was barred and the rope spiked to its beam. Sheriff Harlan stood on his porch with the ledger open, the page blank. He had written everything he knew, every shoe, every laugh, every trace of wax on stone, and still it had not been enough. He closed the book and buckled it to his belt as one might fasten a Bible. Then he lifted his lantern and walked toward the hill. He did not call for deputies. There were none now who would come. The square was full, though no one spoke. Men held torches without lighting them. Women carried unlit candles and clutched rosaries whose beads no longer comforted. When Harlan passed, they parted to let him through. No one tried to stop him. When he reached the road, he found it already lined with watchfires. Old flames banked and gathered as if the town had known he would make this walk. He climbed in their flicker, the wind moving low in the hedges like breath through teeth. The estate gates stood open. They always did. Beyond them, the path was swept, and the hedges clipped tight, every leaf immaculate, as if the house took pride in receiving a final guest. Lantern raised, Harlan mounted the steps. At the threshold he paused, listening. The hymn came not from one room but from all, from the floors and the banisters, from the seams where plaster met wood. He knocked 3 times. The door opened on the last knock and swung inward, careful and polite. Jonathan waited in the hall, black coat uncreased, hands folded neatly before him. Eleanor stood at his shoulder, her veil long enough to pool like shadow around her feet. Between them lay a table on which 12 small objects were arranged: a marble, a ribbon, a wooden horse with one wheel missing, a doll with a crack across her powdered cheek. All were clean, all were new. "You took another," Harlan said. His voice surprised him with its steadiness. "Clara." Eleanor inclined her head. "She is kept." "Then let me in," he said. "Let me see what you call keeping." Jonathan smiled with the patience of a teacher indulging a slow pupil. "You have seen," he said. "You wrote it down. Your town lives by your ledger now." He gestured toward the staircase, where the hymn pressed at the air like a tide. "But come, if you wish to finish your book, finish it in the place where all entries end." "Quite no." They led him upward. Harlan counted the steps without meaning to. 23 to the first landing, 23 more to the second. The portraits watched. The children in their frames, once merely severe, now seemed almost amused. At the top, a corridor ran farther than the house should allow, long as a road under moonlight. Doors lined it, identical, each handle polished bright. As he passed, small drafts kissed his wrists like breath. Behind the last door, the hymn swelled to a pressure that made his teeth ache. Jonathan's hand rested briefly on the knob. Eleanor's fingers brushed the wood as if blessing it. Then the door opened. The room beyond held no furniture, no bed, no chair, no chest for toys, only the pale floorboards and the walls, their paper peeling in damp curls. And yet the room was not empty. The air hummed. Shapes moved where light should have been blank. Child-sized absences, pacing slowly, turning, joining hands and separating again. Harlan's lantern threw no shadow against them as it should have. Instead, the light ran through and around them, as water flows around stone. "Clara," he said, because a father had to be answered, even if by a lie. "Clara, if you can hear me." The air brightened, as if a smile had been turned toward him. A shape paused at his knee, and something like a hand settled there, cold, careful, the pressure barely a weight. The hymn faltered, then continued with a thread of laughter sewn into it. "Do you see?" Eleanor whispered. "They are kept from pain, from hunger, from the knives of men and the winters of this valley. Their feet never tire. Their voices never break." "What feeds the song?" Harlan asked. "Songs do not grow fat on air." Jonathan's smile thinned. "You would make it crude," he said, as if the sacred were a butcher's ledger. It is enough that the covenant holds. It keeps. Harlan set his lantern gently on the floor. He unbuckled the ledger and opened it on the bare boards, the pages yellow as old bone. He took his pencil and wrote, "They are here. They are not bodies. They are pressure and song." He paused, then added, "If I cannot break the covenant, I will write through it." He did not draw his revolver. He had carried it up and down these stairs and found it useless, a hammer held against glass that does not break. Instead, he did the only thing left that belonged to him. He read. He read his entries aloud, each line a rung in a ladder. The cellar and its straps, the 12 pairs of shoes, the attorney's glove rhymed with frost, the watchfires, the pastor's frozen prayer, Clara's shoes placed at the stairs. He read until his throat burned and his eyes spilled, not for sorrow but from the smoke of the words catching at last. For when he reached Clara's name, the hymn hesitated. It did not stop. It did not surrender. But the pitch wavered. The thread pulled taut, as if a knot had been found in the weave. The shapes in the room stilled. Eleanor's veil lifted, though no wind moved. Jonathan's mouth hardened, the courtesy draining from his face. "You do not belong here," Jonathan said softly. "You never did. You confused record with law, and you confused law with God." Harlan replied, and laid his palm flat on the page, blotting his tears with the ledger's paper. Then he spoke the final thing he could give. Not an order, not a prayer, but a promise. "I will keep them," he said. "If keeping is what binds them, I will keep them in words no one can unmake." The hymn thinned, lifted, sharpened, a filament stretched to breaking. The lantern flame guttered sideways, white as hoarfrost. Somewhere far below, a door slammed, and the house exhaled an old breath. The floor pitched without moving. Harlan fell to one knee and did not drop the book. He wrote one last line he could barely see. "If the house keeps, so will I." When he rose, the room had emptied. Not the walls, not the floorboards. They remained. But the pressure had eased. The shapes were gone. The hymn drifted from far away, as if sung down a long corridor of winter. He shut the ledger and turned. Jonathan and Eleanor had stepped back into shadow, their faces gray as mortar. Eleanor's hands were empty. Jonathan's voice, when it came, was little more than breath. "This is not over," he said. "It never is," Harlan answered. He carried the book out of the house. At dawn, the estate burned. No torch touched it. No man set spark to shingle. Flames simply stood up from the windows and walked along the roofline as if called by name. By noon, only stone chimneys remained. No bodies were found. Not Jonathan's, not Eleanor's, not a child's. In the ash near the front steps, 12 pairs of shoes sat in neat rows, untarnished by soot. When the wind rose, they tumbled softly and were gone. Hollow's Edge did not rejoice. It did not mourn in public. It lowered its eyes and repaired what it could. The mill wheel, the church door, the fence rails along the road. Families left in spring and were able, at last, to keep going when the trees greened. Others stayed and tended fields that had grown thin. The bell tolls 12 again. Sheriff Harlan kept his ledger on the church lectern, though no sermons were preached. He turned its pages sometimes when the air felt tight and listened for laughter. It comes, now and then bright and brittle as glass, far off in the woods, where the foundations of a house cool under ivy. If you ask what happened to the Elbridge children, Hollow's Edge will tell you the truest thing it knows. They were not lost. They were kept. And in the years when the wind comes straight from the hills, the town is kept awake, kept wary, kept remembering so that what is sung in shadow cannot be sung in silence.